I'd like to welcome you all to this, our third in our inaugural series of lectures introducing the Asian Studies program to UMBC, co-sponsored, of course, by Humanities Forum and also by the Department of History. Thank you as well to our visitors who, from off campus who braved the weather to come here. Some guests today from St. Paul's School, from girls, Walt Whitman High School, CCBC, among others. Let me take this opportunity as well, since we're bidding for your precious time here, to tell you about the final event in our series this year. Dr. Miralini Sinha from the University of Michigan will be here on April 18th. She's an expert on the Indian subcontinent and will present a talk with a difficult title, Totaram Samadhiya's My 21 Years in Fiji and the Second Abolition. Though the title is difficult, it's about the abolition of indentured labor. So it promises to be very interesting, and I hope you'll be able to join us. To receive notices of the Asian Studies events, we have some flyers in the back. Please like us on Facebook, and I thought I'd be saying that publicly. And of course, if you want to do it the old-fashioned way, please leave your email address, and we'll put you on an email listserv. Finally, let me thank Julie Rosenthal for all the arrangements today, and for our Asian Studies Council of Majors who greeted you at the door and have helped out today. They represent just some of the 33 majors and 16 minors that we have after one semester of the program. Thank you. Thanks to the students. They're the reason we're here. Let me now turn to the reason why we're here specifically today. Of course, our distinguished speaker, Dr. Martin Collcutt, whose talk you can see for yourselves, Pacific Encounter, the Japanese Iwakura Embassy in the United States in 1872. Professor Collcutt has had an unusual career trajectory, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about it today. A native of London, England, he took his degree with honors in European history at Cambridge University. The following year, he earned a certificate in TESOL and went off to Japan, which often changes life courses, where he obtained a position as a lecturer in English language and literature at Yokohama National University. And for another 3 years, moved to the prestigious Tokyo University. Now, during his 6 years in Japan, from 1963 to 1969, he also served as a tutor in English to the then Crown Prince, i.e. the current Emperor Akihito. Given the status of the student, it was customary to send a limousine to pick up the Crown Prince's tutor. But as he's scratching his forehead, I'm sorry. But as Professor Collcutt related to me long ago, and I hope as a historian that I'm relating it to you accurately, some years have passed though, he did not want or care for such treatment, such attention. Instead, he took the subway to the stop right before the Imperial Palace, where he emerged from the underground and got into the awaiting limousine to go that final stretch to the Imperial Palace. As befitting the status of the Crown Prince, who was his student, Professor Collcutt had to ride in the final leg of the journey. But this story, I think, gives you a little bit of insight into the kind of man he is. While in Japan, Professor Collcutt became interested in Japanese history and culture and studied Japanese intensively. He was accepted into the graduate program in Japanese studies at Harvard University, and upon completing the PhD, he taught for 2 years at Harvard before being hired by Princeton University, where he has remained ever since the year 1975, really one of the pillars of that distinguished program. At Princeton, he has served as chair of East Asian Studies for 6 years and as director of the East Asian Studies program for more than a decade. Professor Collcutt has had visiting professorships at some of the most prestigious universities in Japan, at Kyoto University, Tokyo University, Keio University, International Christian University, to name just a few. Given the topic of his talk today, you might be surprised to know that Martin Collcutt is renowned as a scholar of medieval Japan, particularly of Zen Buddhism. His book, 5 Mountains, the Rinzai Zen Monastic Institution in Medieval Japan, has remained required reading for more than 30 years. He is co-author of the wonderful Cultural Atlas of Japan, and I brought my copy because it's one of my favorite books. It's beautifully done and still in print after more than 24 years. We all hope we can be so lucky. He has a chapter in the Cambridge History of Japan on Zen and the Five Mountains, and too many chapters in books and articles to enumerate here. You're also likely to see a chapter by Martin Collcutt in any number of art museum catalogs that you happen to open up that have to do with Japan. The fact that he's asked so frequently to chair panels at major conferences is just an indication of the high level of regard that he enjoys in the field and in the wider profession. For roughly the last decade, Professor Collcutt has turned his focus to more modern times, the Meiji period in particular, with a number of publications on the Iwakura mission, the subject of today's talk, including the very skillful translation of Volume 1 of the official record of the mission, which recounts the embassy's experiences in the US. That too is a beautifully done book. We have the entire collection upstairs. It's a fascinating reading material, as much for what it says about the US as for what it reveals about Japan. I first met Martin Collcutt in 1980 when I was accepted, or I should say more accurately, permitted to enter the PhD program at Princeton. From the start, he took me under his wing, and for more than 30 years, I've considered him my mentor. I've benefited from seeing his skill and kind manner in the classroom. I've served as his teaching assistant and even permitted me to teach one of his courses, Early Japan. Please join me in welcoming an outstanding, well-respected scholar, teacher, a true gentleman, not to mention a master gardener, Professor Martin Collcutt.
I'm a little humbled by that introduction, and it may take me a few moments to catch my breath. Constantine, thank you, and thank everybody for coming. I hope it will become clear as we work through this today why I became interested in this particular topic, and I'll try to clarify that as I proceed. I'm not very adept at PowerPoint, so if things go wrong and I panic, please forgive me. This slide, I would label Departure from Yokohama, December the 23rd, 1871, or the fourth year of the Meiji era, 11th month, 12th day. It was a bright, clear morning. In 1871, less than 20 years after the United States Navy's black ships under Commodore Perry first displayed the might of the United States and the industrialized West to an isolated and still largely feudal Japan, the administration of the new Meiji Emperor dispatched a high-ranking delegation to the United States and Europe. So they were to go to Europe, not just the United States, to renegotiate unequal treaties and trading agreements, and to investigate how Japan might modernize its political and economic institutions. Led by the foreign minister, Iwakura Tomomi, in his capacity as ambassador extraordinary to the United States and Europe. The embassy of politicians, courtiers, and young officials set out from San Francisco on the Pacific mail steamer, America. There were about 100 involved, 46 senior officials from Iwakura on down, but it was a large delegation that was being sent from Japan around the world in late 1871. From San Francisco, so they set out on the Pacific mail steamer America from Yokohama Harbor. From San Francisco, they would travel on the Union Pacific Railroad via Chicago to Washington, where they would meet with President Ulysses Grant. Their stay in the United States was longer than they had planned, and they also had time to visit Chicago and New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. They passed Baltimore, but they didn't spend much time in Baltimore. In their nearly 7 months in the United States, the embassy members were able to observe the infrastructure, industries, and institutions of what they quickly recognized as a new land of boundless opportunity. In San Francisco, Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, they were introduced to influential people and visited factories, schools, museums, public gardens, and hospitals. After their stay in the United States, the embassy turned their attention to the Old World, where they spent a further year examining British manufacturing, industry, German armaments, French culture, meeting crowned heads and chancellors, including Queen Victoria and Otto von Bismarck, and observing people and their lives and manners, from Liverpool to Vienna, from St. Petersburg to Marseille. The embassy sailed for home via the recently opened Suez Canal in July 1873. The embassy members and the other passengers, and here this is what you see, were ferried out to the America in launches and small boats. Here, Iwakura is shown in the center there on this launch, is shown in his robes of state as the formal ambassador plenipotentiary from the Meiji Emperor of Japan, flanked by vice ambassadors Kido Takayoshi and Okubo Toshimichi. A crowd of Japanese and a few Western well-wishers were on the dock to see them off and wish them a safe and productive journey. Now, the principal chronicler of the embassy, and Constantine has mentioned him already, was a young man, Kuhn Kunitake, who later published a very detailed report in Japanese after they had returned to Japan. About 5 years later, he published a very detailed, comprehensive account, kind of diary or record of the embassy's travels in America and all over Europe. This is volume 1. I'm going to pass it around so you can have a look and maybe glance a little bit at it. Don't get too deeply involved in it, though. Please pass it on. So anyway, Kuhn Kunitake, the principal chronicler of the embassy, wrote on the 12th day of December. That is December the 12th day, December the 23rd. He starts by saying, "Fine rain at night. The recent fine weather has continued and the cold is not unduly severe. This morning the dawn frost was especially heavy and the sun rising over Japan seemed extremely bright. At 8 o'clock in the morning, everyone gathered at the prefectural office. They're in Yokohama now. They've come down from Tokyo to Yokohama and spent the night there. We left there at 10 and went by carriage to the harbor, where we boarded steam launches. At that moment, a 19-gun salute was fired from the shore battery to honor the embassy. That was followed by a 15-gun salute to celebrate the return to the United States of the American minister in Japan, Mr. Charles DeLong." Now this guy, Charlie DeLong, is a kind of background figure who plays a major role and whose work with the embassy and in Japanese-American relations in that period I don't think has been fully explored. But his name is going to come up several times during this presentation. So anyway, Charles DeLong was honored in leaving Japan, traveling with the embassy. And with him, as you'll see, was his wife and family. Oh, I smashed it. So a salvo then resounded over the waves, and the reverberations continued for some time. All the members of the embassy and the students, and still I'm with Kuhn, these are Kuhn's words, who were going to study in America and Europe, making a total of 54 peers and former samurai and commoners, including 4 girls. Actually, there were 5 girls. Kume made a mistake, as you'll see. Embarked on the paddle steamer. As each found his or her assigned cabin and attended to unpacking their luggage, for a time there was considerable confusion. At noon, a cannon was fired to signal the departure. The anchors were raised and the brakes on the paddle wheels released. Sailors on the deck of the many foreign warships in Yokohama Bay all lined up at attention, doffing their caps and saluting as we passed. We were followed for several miles by a crowd of well-wishers in a flotilla of small boats. So you can see they left Japan, and as they left Japan, it was recognized that an embassy of some significance was setting out to travel the world. Oh, sorry. Here you see Commodore Perry, as you look at it on the left, and a Russian navigator, Vasilievich Putyatin. Commodore Perry first. On the 8th of July, 1853, Commodore Perry of the United States East India Squadron, backed by 4 black ships as they were called, sailed into Uraga, a small port at the entrance to Tokyo Bay. He refused Tokugawa Bakufu orders to use Nagasaki Bay. Perry had instructions to present gifts and not to open fire, but the black ships with their powerful guns threatened Edo, or Tokyo as we know it. They were also symbols of technological progress that disturbed the Japanese. The Tokugawa Bakufu, or shogunate, was obliged to accept a letter from President Millard Fillmore demanding the opening of the country and trading privileges, and Perry said he would return for an answer the following year. A year later, Perry returned to Japanese waters, this time with a squadron of 8 vessels, including the Powhatan, a steamship of 2,400 tons. He called for a response to Fillmore's letter and presented the draft of a treaty. The shogunate had little choice but to conclude the US-Japan Treaty of Peace and Amity on the 31st of March, 1854. The main provision was for the small ports of Shimoda and Hakodate to be opened largely as harbors of refuge, but no mention was made of trade. But this treaty opened the way for a whole series of what are called unequal treaties with the US and European powers. Against its will, the Bakufu, the warrior government of Japan at the time, was forced to enter into unequal treaties, first with the United States, then with Britain and other European countries. Now, a little bit about Putyatyn, a Russian naval officer who competed with Perry in the opening of Japan. Vice Admiral Putyatyn arrived in Nagasaki on the 21st of August, 1853, and negotiated a Russo-Japanese Treaty of Amity, the Nichiro Washin Joyaku, completed on the 7th of February, 1855 at Shimoda. The Kuril Islands were divided between Russia and Japan. The treaty opened Shimoda, Hakodate, and Nagasaki to Russian vessels. Putyatyn returned to Japan on the 19th of August, 1858, to conclude the first Russo-Japanese Treaty of Friendship and Commerce at Edo. So from this I think you can get some sense of the pressure from not only from the United States and from Britain and France and other European countries, but also from Russia that was bearing down on Japan in these decades. And the failure to be able to deal with this effectively led to the overthrow of the Tokugawa regime, the Tokugawa government. Let's see if we can get this one. Okay. Commodore Perry's, then here he returns now with, having promised to come back the following year, returns with 8 of these very strong vessels. His superior military force was a factor in negotiating a treaty allowing America to trade with Japan. Perry returned to Shimoda and Edo in 1854 with a fleet of 8 warships. These black ships with their powerful cannons could easily have bombarded Edo. The shogunate reluctantly signed a treaty of amity and commerce with the United States, establishing formal diplomatic relations. Within 5 years, Japan had signed similar unequal treaties with maybe as many as 13 or 14 other countries. Here we see foreigners and foreign ships in Yokohama, and I'll get to the Japanese text in a moment. So within a few years then of the signing of these first treaties, the Bakufu had abandoned its policy of sakoku, of trying to keep the country secluded or closed, and entered into treaties of amity and commerce with America and other Western powers. Yokohama and several other ports were opened and foreigners came and lived there. There were several hundred foreign troops resident in Yokohama. Japan was subject to something called extraterritoriality, or Chigai Hoken, the Japanese characters there. So it did not have full control over its ports. Foreigners were not subject to Japanese courts. If foreigners committed offenses in Japan, then they would be tried by foreign courts, and the Japanese had no real control over them. And also, Japan had lost its tariff autonomy, or kanzei jishuken. In other words, foreign commodities could be imported into Japan, and the Japanese couldn't tax them as they would have liked to be able to tax them. This slide shows the shogun Tokugawa shogun Yoshinobu, the last of the Tokugawa shoguns, returns his ruling authority to the Meiji emperor. The Meiji emperor is invisible, and you see the shogun there with his swords beside him, kneeling in front of what I assume are other daimyo, or major warriors, provincial warrior chieftains, who are recognizing what is happening, that the power of the Bakufu, the Tokugawa shogunate, is now being returned formally and officially to the Meiji emperor. The Tokugawa Bakufu, or shogunate, was unable to respond effectively to external pressure and the internal challenge from the pro-imperial domains led by Satsuma and Choshu. And these are domains that are challenging the Tokugawa and feel that Japan needs to change and that the imperial rule should be restored. Pro-Bakufu forces were defeated in battle. Tokugawa Yoshinobu was the 15th Tokugawa shogun. The Tokugawa shogunate came to its official end on November the 9th, 1867, when Yoshinobu formally put his prerogatives at the emperor's disposal and resigned 10 days later. This was effectively the so-called restoration, Taisei Hokan, of imperial rule, although Yoshinobu continued, of course, to be treated with respect and retained some influence. Here we see the Meiji emperor of the day. The young emperor, his dates, born in 1852, died in 1912, so he would have been around 20 at this time. And here he's seen in Western military costume with a sword. With the Tokugawa Bakufu defeated, power was returned to the emperor, who was moved from the imperial palace in Kyoto to Edo Castle, Tokyo as we know it. And this became the location of the new Meiji imperial government. The real power in the new government, the real individuals who were powerful, were samurai, or still regarded themselves as samurai probably, from the domains of Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa in western Japan, who had organized the overthrow of the Bakufu, and court nobles, including Iwakura Tomomi, who had been in secret alliance with these western samurai as they challenged the Tokugawa Bakufu. So you have then the sense of the Meiji restoration has taken place, the young emperor has been restored, and then advised by a number of people who will see, it's the Meiji emperor who is sending out this mission to the world. This shows the leaders of the Meiji restoration. In the center, in his robes of state, is Iwakura Tomomi. At that time, he was age 47, probably the oldest member of the embassy, the ambassador, as he was called, plenipotentiary, minister of the right. He's dressed in formal court robes, haori hakama, and as you look, you'll see he has a kind of top knot worn by courtiers of the day. I think to his left on this side, closer to me, is Ukubo Toshimichi, former samurai from Satsuma, age 41, vice ambassador on the embassy, also serving as Minister of Finance in the early Meiji government. On the other side, over on that side of the room, is Kido Takayoshi from the Choshu domain, age 39, also a vice ambassador, counselor of state. And these three then, Iwakura, Okubo, and Kido, were the three heavyweights in the embassy, the ambassador and vice ambassadors. But there were two other important figures. Standing in the background, again on the other side, away from me, I think is Ito Hirobumi, at that time age 31, from Saga Prefecture, vice ambassador and senior counselor of public works. And Ito, only some months before the embassy had left, had come to the United States to check out on banking systems and finance. So he was something of a financial expert. He had been in Britain, he spoke English well, and he was able to understand. So many of the Japanese, of course, didn't speak English or other European languages, so they were a little bit helpless. But Ito spoke and was respected for his abilities in English. And then another younger warrior, former warrior, Yamaguchi Naoyoshi, junior counselor of foreign affairs. So these are the five senior figures. This is Kume, Kunitake, and the volume, the Japanese volume that you've seen of the, in Japanese it would be the Tokume, Zenken, Beo, Kairan, Jiki. So Kume, a scholarly young samurai, aged about 33 in 1872, was selected to serve as the personal assistant to Ambassador Iwakura and the principal record keeper for the embassy. The kanji, or the characters reading Tokume Zenken, Taishi Beo Kairan Jiki, can be translated as a true account of the ambassador extraordinary and plenipotentiary's journey of observation through the United States of America and Europe. And as I mentioned earlier, published in 5 volumes in 1878. Now, Kume was an extraordinarily talented, bright intellectual for a samurai. He was trained in Confucianism, or he trained himself in Confucianism, and he was an assiduous record keeper and historian. And if some of you are interested in this period and can borrow these volumes from the library, I think you'll find it's a fascinating observation of the world as Kume records it as the embassy travels. I think it's a very perceptive diary of their experiences in the various countries and people that they visited. This map of the world shows the Iwakura Embassy's world tour, the route taken and the countries visited. The route included 14 countries with which Japan had signed unequal treaties. First America, then the United Kingdom, then Europe and Russia, and then home by the Suez Canal and Asia. And of course they give less attention, they do stop in Shanghai on the return home, they give less attention to Asia. They were more, Kume and others were more concerned with observations of America and Europe. They had thought it would take them 10 months. They had been told, well, if you guys travel around the world in 1871, 72, you can probably get home in 10 months. It actually took them 1 year and 9 months to complete their mission. So as you'll see, and on the America part of the trip too, they were delayed in various places, but we'll get to that. Their respected foreign advisor, and there were a number of foreigners in Japan before the embassy left who were giving advice. One of them was a missionary from the United States, but had been in Japan for some time, Guido Verbeek. And he suggested the mission should first visit European countries. And this is the natural thing to think about, I suppose, in Japan at that time. If you're going to see the world, well, go to Europe, go to Britain first, and then go on from there. The British ambassador in Tokyo, etc., all argued for Europe first itinerary. Why did they first go to the United States? They presumably thought the US would be more favorable and liberal starting point, and were perhaps suspicious of Britain after her aggressive inroads into China in the Opium Wars. In the case of the United States, moreover, there was an advancing frontier which had reached California, a neighbor on the coastline of the Pacific Ocean, and one that was linked from 1869 onward by a transcontinental railroad to its eastern seaboard, and also regular vessels across the Pacific from Yokohama, from Hong Kong and Shanghai and Yokohama into San Francisco. Also, there were influential Americans in Tokyo, one of them the American ambassador or representative in Japan at the time, Charles DeLong, the American ambassador, were pressing the Japanese for an America First decision with regard to their journey. This is a map of San Francisco around 1872, showing the city, the harbor, and the Golden Gate. San Francisco was a thriving city with a population of about 150,000 in 1872. The city had grown as a result of the Great Gold Rush, the extension of the Transcontinental Railroad, and steamer connections with Asia, etc. The America arrived, that is the steamship on which they had taken them about 23 days, I think, to cross the Pacific, arrived outside the Golden Gate before dawn on the morning of January the 15th, 1872. The steamer waited in thick fog for the dawn light, then made its way slowly through the Golden Gate and into San Francisco Bay. It was known by newspaper reports and by telegraph connections that the America had arrived, and that on board an important Japanese embassy sent out on a world mission by the Emperor of Japan was traveling. They received a 13-gun salute as they steamed in past Alcatraz Island. The America docked at the Pacific Steam Navigation Company wharves at about 10:30 on the morning of January the 15th, 1872. A reception committee of the mayor and local notables had been hastily assembled to welcome the Japanese embassy and Ambassador Charles DeLong, who was well known in California. Charlie DeLong, before he was sent as ambassador to Japan, had been in the Nevada and California gold fields. He had lots of connections there, and as we'll see, he used those connections to have the Japanese welcomed and to try to establish closer relations between especially California, but the United States and Japan. Many people gathered on the wharf, including local dignitaries and some Japanese students. The arrival of the embassy was written up in San Francisco and California newspapers, and the news was carried by telegraph across the United States and around the world. Charles DeLong had quickly contacted the money men of California and told them that this was an important embassy and that California stood to benefit from increased trade, travel, job opportunities, and money lending with Japan. San Francisco street scene, streetcars, horse-drawn carriages, and people. In 1872, San Francisco was a lively, rapidly growing city. It had prospered as a result of the gold rush, as I said. The Transcontinental Railroad linked it to the Midwest and the East Coast. It was a major gateway to the Pacific. Regular steamers were making connections with Japan and China and bringing in a growing number of immigrants from China and soon from Japan. And of course, this again is one of the issues, the subliminal issue, shall we say, with the arrival of the Japanese, and the fact that in the same steamer that the America that these Japanese were riding in state in the upper decks of the steamer, they were probably in the steerage compartment way down below, maybe 100 or more than 100 Chinese laborers, immigrant laborers, who were coming into California on the same vessel. So efforts were made, and again by DeLong, to distinguish the Japanese who are coming as dignified visitors from the Chinese immigrants who are coming in. And people in California were, as those of you who study US history in the 19th century will know, were already sensitive to that particular issue. For the Japanese visitors, it must have been an exciting place to start their world tour and to gain first impressions of America. Right. This is the Grand Hotel at Market Street and Montgomery Street in San Francisco. This is where Ambassador Iwakura and the senior members of the embassy were accommodated. Others, the younger members, were put into other guest houses or hotels in San Francisco. The Japanese were impressed by the size, the scale, the grandeur, the modern amenities of the Grand Hotel. Kuhn has quite a long description of what this, for them, very new experience of a foreign hotel was like. And part of that description is the lobby had deep carpets and marble walls. The rooms had elegant curtains. A gaslit chandelier gave light. Even at night, it seemed like daytime. If you pulled a bell cord, a maid would come. When you turned on a faucet, water flowed out. Fancy baths, etc., he goes on. Here they could, in a sense, feel Western civilization with their skins. And then on January the 23rd, so they arrived on the 15th, morning of the 15th, on the 23rd, a grand banquet was given in honor of the embassy at the Grand Hotel. More than 300 guests attended this splendid occasion. And again, Kuhn gives an account of this, but in the newspapers of the day, the San Francisco newspapers, it's described in great detail. The speeches are recorded, and clearly from the governor, the mayor of San Francisco, all of the influential people in that area were present at the banquet to welcome the Japanese. It was a really big public occasion. The characters underneath it say W.C. Ralston. William Chapman Ralston. one of the richest men in California, a good friend of Charles DeLong, he became a patron of the Iwakura Embassy. Self-made millionaire, founder and president of the Bank of California, Ralston was involved in building railroads, establishing woolen mills, sugar refineries, silk factories, steamship lines to Australia and China. He was a member of the San Francisco Citizens Reception Committee for the embassy, met them when they arrived, introduced them to other influential people in the Bay Area. He owned the Grand Hotel. He probably arranged for them to stay there. He also owned a theater in San Francisco, which they visited for an evening performance. And it was written up in the newspapers. I think it was maybe an operatic performance. Some of the Japanese were snoozing off during the performance. Ralston was eager to pursue trade with Japan, helped to arrange financial loans for the Japanese government. He and the other money men in San Francisco, D.O. Mills, there were half a dozen of them who were very wealthy from their work with gold and other development in San Francisco, were convinced that California and America stood to benefit enormously from the emergence and opening up of Japan, and they should therefore lavish attention on the embassy. And they did. And this was recorded in the local newspapers from San Francisco to Sacramento and across the United States, and then from the United States into Europe. So preceding the Japanese, before they arrived in any city, there was news about this embassy and the way in which they were being treated with such dignity and respect as they proceeded. Five girls in kimono with Mrs. DeLong. All of them are named, and from the left I'll just give you the names and then we'll say a little bit more about them. Yamakawa Stematsu, Yoshimasu Ryo, Tsuda Ume, Mrs. DeLong in the center, Ueda Tei, and Nagai Shige. And a little bit about them, and working from the oldest down. Ueda Tei was age 16 at that time. She returned to Japan in 1872. Yoshimasa Ryo, or Ryoko, was age 15. In the United States, she stayed with a family in Washington, the Landmans, who were connected with the Japanese embassy or delegation there, and they were very kind to her. She returned to Japan in 1872, taught English in Tokyo for some years, but died of cholera at the age of 30. Then Yamakawa, or Oyama Stemasu, who was age 12. She was in the United States from January 1872 to November 1882, so she stayed for 10 years. She graduated from Vassar in 1882. After return to Japan, she worked for the Red Cross and married a general, Oyama Iwao, in 1883. Then Nagai Shigeko was age 9. She was in the United States from January 1872 until 1881, graduated from Vassar, where she studied art and music. She later taught piano in Tokyo and married an admiral in the Japanese Navy. And then the littlest one, who is there, the center back, Tsuda Umeko, was age 8 in 1872, in the United States from January 1872 until 1882, received her primary and secondary education there, and again from 1889 to 1892. In the United States, she stayed with the Landmans, studied at the Archer Institute and Bryn Mawr College, where she became interested in English, biology, and education. She later became active in education in Japan, and in 1900, she founded the Joshi Eigaku Juku, or later as it's known, Tsuda Daigaku, or Tsuda Jiku Daigaku, one of the leading women's colleges in Japan. So this 8-year-old girl, 7 years old perhaps by Japanese counting, because warriors, former samurai, were being encouraged by the government, and the influence of the Meiji emperor was present. He thought that women should receive more education, and it was suggested that women be included, girls be included on this trip to the United States, and that they study foreign languages and learn more about the world there before returning to Japan. When her father, Tsuda Senyu, saw Tsuda Umeko, the littlest one, off in Yokohama, he gave her an English dictionary with an inscription in English. My daughter Ume from Father Tsuda Senyu, Edo, December the 19th, 1871, as a parting gift for a daughter whom he thought he might never see again, perhaps. This is a Pullman Express engine, and the Japanese characters simply say sleeping car or shindaisha. A 5-car Pullman train was specially provided for the embassy and sent out to Oakland to meet them. So this was a very distinguished embassy who are getting first-class treatment wherever they go. And it was decided that they should have their own Pullman Express to take them across the United States. Kuhn, in his record, calls it a sleeping car, very latest in railroad luxury. The cars were heated and equipped with gas lamps, and although it was midwinter, they were warm and comfortable in the train. They could talk among themselves, enjoy the splendid scenery, or snooze as they liked, and Kuhn has records of this. This is a Pullman train, I think it's a Pullman, passing through snow sheds in the high Sierra Nevada mountains. So they intended to leave San Francisco within a few days or within a week or so, but actually it took them a couple of weeks because there were snow blockades along the railroad that winter. And they were delayed leaving San Francisco, and as we'll see, they were delayed in several other ways along the railroad. But anyway, as they moved into the high Sierra Nevada mountains, they passed through these snow sheds. The snow in the mountains was heavy that winter. The embassy's departure from San Francisco was delayed by a week because of a snow blockade in the Rockies. Some of the Japanese students had gone ahead on earlier trains from San Francisco to New York, but had been held up on the line because of snow blockades. They had a hard time. Kuhn was impressed by views from the train as it climbed into the Sierra Nevada mountains, and he quoted Chinese poetry to convey the beauty of the scenery. So again, Kuhn, although he's recording in English, or he's recording in Japanese, and is a diarist, still the Confucian influences and his readings of Chinese poetry come out in situations and scenes like this. Salt Lake City, the main street of Salt Lake around that time, and the residence of Brigham Young. Population of Salt Lake probably about 14,000 in 1872. Western pioneer town, the center of the Mormon church settlement. The embassy arrived here unexpectedly in the afternoon of February the 4th. They had no intention of visiting Salt Lake City. They wanted to get on to Chicago and Washington and East Coast. The Japanese had not planned to visit. The embassy had expected to change trains in Ogden in Utah and then carry on to Chicago. But because of snow blockades in the Rocky Mountains ahead of them, they were diverted into Salt Lake City. Here they were obliged to find hotels and wait for the tracks ahead to be cleared. Some of them were able to find rooms at the Townsend House Hotel. The citizens of Salt Lake were naturally surprised when the Japanese suddenly turned up. 50 or 60 Japanese suddenly arrive in your city, and they're dignitaries. How do you deal with them? The Japanese had a further chance to learn more about the opening up of the Western United States and about the Mormon religion and Mormon pioneering efforts. B. Young, Brigham Young. Brigham Young, born in 1881, died in 1877, was then in his 70s, quite healthy. Kuhn wrote, Mr. Young, 71 years old this year, is hale and hearty, and has 16 wives and 48 children. He has accumulated a tremendous fortune. Charles DeLong arranged, because they had unexpectedly arrived in Salt Lake City, Charles DeLong arranged for the embassy to visit Brigham Young, who was then under house arrest. In other words, the federal government had problems with Brigham Young and with the Mormon practice of marriage practices. So Brigham Young was under house arrest and in a sense was a sort of persona non grata. So Kiddo and others in the embassy, that is the vice ambassadors, met Brigham Young, were invited and entertained. Iwakura, however, as the principal ambassador, didn't go. And I think there must have been some discussion in a sense that perhaps it was not appropriate for Iwakura as the principal ambassador to meet this person who was formerly under house arrest by the federal government. So anyway, Iwakura did not attend because of the house arrest pending trial for, as I put down here, lascivious cohabitation with several wives. And the visit was criticized in some non-Mormon newspapers. So it was picked up that the Japanese had visited him. Steam engine and carriages in the Rockies. Spectacular scenery on the Union Pacific Railroad, probably in Utah or Nevada, describing the descent by the Truckee River in Nevada. Kuhn wrote, "From Truckee Station, the train descended beside the brawling whitewater rapids of the tumbling Truckee River. As it flows down from the mountains from the lake, the river passes Truckee Station, then races along beside the railway tracks. The sound of the roaring river, like the wind keening in pine trees, was very refreshing. It is said that the mountain peaks clustered here almost touch the sky, and that the majestic scenery is simply magnificent. Unfortunately, in the darkness, in their sleeping car, we could not see it for ourselves." So this is the scene that they might have seen. The building of the railroad had been a massive achievement, opening up the whole of the West, including spectacular mountain scenery linking the eastern, central, and western United States. What had once taken months on horseback or in covered wagons could now be covered in 7 days. A Pullman train among buffalo and buffalo hunters. Cowboys and hunters shooting buffalo from the train. This has really no connection with the embassy, and there's no knowing whether they saw anything like this. But it's said that these kinds of scenes were going on at the time. On the prairies, cattle drives were still taking place, and buffaloes were being hunted. But what I'd like you to notice again is the telegraph wires, the telegraph poles, and the telegraph wires beside the railroad track. The telegraph wire, the major dune development in communication, runs above the railroad track. And of course, again, in terms of advertising this embassy, the telegraph played a major role. The title for this one I've given White Cavalry, General Custer at War Against American Indians, or Whites versus Native Americans, battle scene. Native Americans were being rapidly killed and displaced in the West, maybe part of manifest destiny. Pride in westward expansion, America now bigger, more united than Europe. From the train, the Japanese sometimes saw Native Americans. Kuhn has several entries relating to their history, customs, and treatment by white settlers and soldiers. While passing through the Humboldt Wilderness in Elko County, Nevada, for example, Kuhn expressed his views on the ancestry and treatment of Native Americans. He says, "American Indians live in this area. From the train windows, we sometimes caught sight of their winter dwellings. All the land around here was the territory of the native Indians. In recent years, however, Americans," he means white Americans, I think, "have deprived them of their land, pushing them out, and the indigenous inhabitants are angry, their desire for revenge implacable. When the railroad was first constructed, the Indians banded together and tore up the rails or rolled boulders onto the tracks in a continued effort to impede the trains. Enraged, they shot quiverfuls of poisoned arrows at the railroad passengers." So they've left Utah. They're trying to get to the East Coast. They go via Chicago. And as they approach Chicago, and before approaching it, they have been told that there was a great fire in Chicago in October the 8th to the 10th of 1871. Chicago at that time had a population perhaps of about 300,000, had been growing rapidly. A great fire had ravaged the city only a few months before the Japanese arrived. The fire burned from Sunday, October the 8th to early Tuesday, October the 10th, 1871, killing some 300 people, destroying over 17,000 buildings. Of course, the city rose from the ashes and quickly became the gleaming beacon of the Midwest. The mayor and other Chicago citizens were eager to have the Japanese embassy visit the city. The mayor of Chicago actually sent telegrams while the Japanese were in San Francisco. He knew that they were arrived, and he was, in a sense, pleading with the organizers of the embassy to come via Chicago. And he would very much like to host their visit. So the Japanese then arrived in the city. Iwakura gave a check from the Japanese government for $5,000 to assist the rebuilding effort of the city. This was widely noted in newspapers, and not only in Chicago, but the Japanese embassy coming through had contributed $5,000, which at that time was quite an amount of money, to the Chicago building effort. In other words, they knew the city had been ravaged by fire, and they were sympathetic and wanted to try and do something about it, and this was taken very well. Kuhn recognized the vitality and wealth of Chicago and also referred to the Great Fire. As he said, Chicago is the southern entrepot for transportation on the Great Lakes. Most of the products of the Mississippi River Valley and the northern states pour into this city. Year by year it flourishes and grows more prosperous. The rows of roof tiles touch the clouds, and you cannot see mountains in any direction. The shops of wealthy merchants line the streets. There are thousands of rich individuals living in Chicago, and the power of their collective capital almost exceeds the wealth of New York City. And then he goes on to say, on the night of October the 9th last year, a fire started which quickly roared into a huge conflagration. Over 20,000 buildings in the most flourishing sections were reduced to ashes. The fire continued to burn for more than 2 whole days. The loss of property was estimated at $500 million. People who were caught in this disaster lost their property, family treasures, and businesses, wandered the streets homeless and starving. It is said to have been the worst fire since the city was founded. Today, through our ambassador, the embassy donated $5,000, etc. Here we see somebody you're now familiar with, Ambassador Iwakura, in Western dress. And the kanji says Kaika Fuja, enlightenment, chill. Iwakura's 3 sons, he had 3 sons, were then studying at Rutgers University. They came to meet him in Chicago. They'd been in touch by telegraph. They knew he was traveling. They knew he was heading the embassy. They were hoping to meet him. And they came out to Chicago to meet him. And there, they urged him to travel in Western dress. Daddy, you look funny, they probably said to him. It's time you got into Western costume. People will be laughing at you in those funny robes. So anyway, he changed dress for, as we'll see, only for some occasions. And one of the conservative statesmen with the embassy or associated with it, Sasaki Takayuki, lamented that Iwakura had been bitten by the Western Enlightenment bug. In other words, he's gone over too far in a Western direction. But it wasn't only Iwakura. The 5 girls, also from Chicago on, were in Western dresses and hats. Mrs. DeLong, who had been the patron and tutor and caretaker and caregiver for the girls, she had kept them in kimono. And she obviously had enjoyed the publicity of having these 5 Japanese young ladies around her and getting a lot of attention. Her husband was getting attention in a different way, but she was clearly enjoying being their sort of patron and protector. The girls, however, didn't like being treated as they were when they walked around the streets of San Francisco or Chicago in kimono. And people would come up to them and maybe feel the kimono and say, "What's this?" and make funny remarks which they didn't fully understand. So they had attracted a lot of attention. And they were not happy being referred to as it was sometimes written in the paper, the Japanese princesses, when they appeared in public. From their arrival in San Francisco, they were asking Mrs. DeLong to wear Western dress. And nice dresses had been made for them in San Francisco, but I think Mrs. DeLong resisted allowing the girls to wear the dresses that were immediately made. But however, in Chicago, they were eventually given permission to wear the dresses, and before they reached Washington, clearly they seemed very happy to be traveling now in Western costume. This is a slide of Washington, D.C., a view of the city around 1872. I'm not sure exactly when it is, but it shows the White House highlighted closer to us. The partially completed Washington Memorial Tower highlighted on the right of the picture, and the Capitol highlighted among the streets and houses of DC. The Arlington Hotel where the ambassador stayed was near the White House. Again, they were put up in a fairly lavish hotel. When they arrived at the hotel, they found that the president's wife, President Grant's wife, Julia Dent Grant, had sent a magnificent bouquet of flowers to decorate the lobby of the hotel to welcome this distinguished embassy, and Kuhn records that. So they were staying at the hotel or in several other hotels in Washington, and it was quickly arranged for them to meet President Grant. And here you see the embassy leaders presenting their credentials as representatives of the Meiji Emperor and the Empire of Japan to President Grant and the Secretary of State of that day, Hamilton Fish. And you can see Grant, the bearded, rather less tall figure, and the taller figure standing beside him is Hamilton Fish. President Ulysses Grant, born 1822, 1855, general of the Northern Armies, victor in the Civil War, was elected the 18th president in 1869. In the entry for March the 4th, 1872, Kuhn wrote, "At noon we were granted the honor of a formal state reception at which we presented our diplomatic credentials to President Grant. Iwakura, the vice ambassadors are shown wearing robes of state and their funny hats, the eboshi, and long swords. Iwakura clearly wanted to convey the impression that he was the representative of an imperial envoy from a country with a long history. President Grant was accompanied by Hamilton Fish, his Secretary of State. Mori Arinori, the Japanese representative in Washington, was also present. Mori was representing, in a sense, the Japanese and the embassy and getting the best treatment for them he could. The Japanese would soon begin to discuss unequal treaties with Hamilton Fish, but they were unable to gain more favorable terms. The discussions dragged on for months. So here again, they had expected to come through Washington, maybe to spend a week or two, discuss, perhaps negotiate the treaties. If things didn't work out, then they would go on with their travel. But they became involved in long discussions, and two members of the embassy actually had to return to Japan to get instructions from then the Japanese government as to how they should proceed. So it was going to take them months, in fact, to conclude these discussions. Here we see Iwakura again. He made a visit to the US Congress on March the 6th, 1872. The leaders of the embassy were invited to visit the session of Congress where a debate was in progress. Iwakura offered greetings in the House of Representatives. Here again he's shown in Western dress with the Capitol Rotunda in the background. And as Kuhn records it, Iwakura said, "We have come to attain civilization and enlightenment. Just as the water from Japan's many rivers mingles with the Pacific Ocean, so both our nations' interests, Japan's interests, America's interests, mingle and blend. The waters of the Pacific are so intermingled that they cannot be separated. Likewise, our countries." This is a slide showing a grand reception for the Japanese in Washington, D.C. On March the 12th, President Grant hosted a banquet for the Japanese visitors in the Blue Room of the White House. Kuhn recorded, March the 12th, snow in the morning, fine in the afternoon. At 8:30 in the evening, having received an invitation to a banquet from President Grant, we set out by carriage for the White House. We were led to the Blue Room, where we were presented to the President and leading civil and military officers, who were all accompanied by their ladies. At dinner, everyone was extremely cordial. Chatting across the tables, we enjoyed the banquet, which ended at 11 o'clock. In the West, the host observes great courtesy and elaborate etiquette in giving such a party, which enhances the importance of the gathering. It is considered proper etiquette for main guests to always attend as couples. 2 days later, on March the 14th, the Japanese embassy gave a banquet party at their hotel for government officials and wealthy merchants. More than 1,000 people are said to have attended. This, sorry, before leaving this, no, this is, sorry, I'm all right. This slide shows a Japanese, his name is given there in characters, Hida Tamayoshi. And he visited Philadelphia factories. Hida, born 1830, died 1889, had been a student of Dutch learning and served the Tokugawa shogunate as a naval officer and military specialist. Kuhn wrote, March the 15th, 1872, an invitation from the city of Philadelphia arrived for the embassy to visit that city. So they're in Washington, and people from Philadelphia come and ask the Japanese embassy to come and visit Philadelphia. Commissioner Hida and some others accepted the invitation. They went to the Bethlehem Steel Company and visited several factories making machinery. Hida had earlier come to the United States as a mechanic on a steamship. He was an engineer, very interested in technology shown to them. They had many questions for their guides. And one thing I haven't said is that from San Francisco on, they were invited to visit schools, factories, public gardens, almost anything that could be of interest to the Japanese visitors, they were shown. And if you read the Kuhn record, you see that he regards this as all part of the education that they were receiving. How do Americans organize public gardens? Who visits public gardens? What are schools like at all kinds of levels? So they were, because they had a lot of time, they were able to see all kinds of facets of American society in that day. This shows Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Hudson River, East River, ferry boats, etc. On June the 10th, 1872, with little progress being made in the treaty discussions in Washington, the embassy set out on a tour of the New England states. So they have time on their hands, time to kill. They're getting bored. The tour had not originally been planned by the Japanese ambassadors, and it was paid by the US government. Hamilton Fish, with the approval of President Grant, secured a special $50,000 appropriation from Congress for the entertainment of the Japanese embassy while it was in the United States. $50,000 to send them on a pleasure trip, essentially, around the Northeastern states. They were impressed by the bustle and vigor of New York City, by the beauty of Central Park. The population, I'm not sure of the population of New York at that time, but several 100,000, period of rapid commercial and industrial expansion after the Civil War, of course. Again, New York City, Broadway, the St. Nicholas Hotel, and something of a bustling street scene. From the ferry, they were taken by carriage to the St. Nicholas Hotel on Broadway. They may have used several other hotels because there were still about 50 of them in the group. Kuhn wrote about the vitality and bustling activity of the busy streets. And this is a sort of a translation of that text you see there in characters. Kuhn commented that the Broadway Hotel was noisy. He goes on to say, "This is the most crowded street in the world. In the hotel rooms overlooking Broadway, the din at times rivaled 10,000 thunderclaps, or a gale blowing through a forest of pine trees. All day long, the squeal and rattle of carriages and streetcars filled our ears, and the noise was such that we could hardly carry on a conversation." He also commented that after dark, the streets were not safe. Robbers and prostitutes, he saw this as one of the byproducts of excessive freedom in Republican societies. So the Japanese were learning, Kuhn was learning, but they weren't entirely uncritical of what they were seeing as they traveled, and he records this. The Manhattan cityscape, the Hudson River, East Rivers, and then by ferry to West Point. On June the 11th, 1872, they rode on a ferry boat up the Hudson River to West Point. Kuhn wrote, "We left the hotel at 8 o'clock this morning, boarded the steamer Chauncey Vibard at the pier at the mouth of the East River, and steamed around the tip of the battery and up the Hudson River. At West Point, they were greeted as honored guests. The members of the mission stayed at the West Point House Hotel on the campus and were invited to exercises for the graduating class. They also watched cadets doing their military exercises. Kuhn wrote, "This afternoon we watched the cadets doing infantry drills. 6 companies make up 1 battalion. The cadets demonstrated basic drills, including marching in slow and quick time, falling in, dispersing, and rallying. They must master these drill sequences before they become officers, and their drill was extremely professional." Kuhn also recorded that they were shown a Gatling gun, the predecessor, of course, of the machine gun. There was also a newly invented American gun called a Gatling gun, which fires many shots from multiple barrels, the muzzles of which resemble a honeycomb. When a crank is turned and the barrels rotate, the cartridges loaded in the magazine above the firing mechanism drop into the revolving barrels and are fired. Sorry, no, I'm still there, okay. As many as 200 or 300 rounds can be fired every 6 or 7 seconds. This kind of gun is said to have killed many soldiers during the Civil War. So again, you see that in various places they visited, they are shown all kinds of things that could provide useful information. And Kuhn is not the only one. There were other members of the trip who were recording things that they had seen. And this becomes part of the collective understanding that develops in Japan in subsequent years of the technology, the organization, the educational systems, the social practices of not only the United States, but other countries around the world. So from West Point, they headed up. They're still on this funded trip that they're making the Northeastern states. This shows a suspension bridge over the river at Niagara Falls. Staying for a few days at the International Hotel in Niagara, they viewed the Great Falls, Goat Island, and the Whirlpool Falls at leisure. Kuhn described their feelings as they crossed the slender suspension bridges overlooking the Horseshoe Falls. The outer bridge is about 600 feet downstream from the falls and suspended only by 2 steel cables. At the middle, the bridge seemed very narrow, and high above the deep gorge, it felt very unsteady, as if we were floating in the sky. When the bridge shook, we all became terrified and broke into a cold sweat. It felt dangerous and was even more thrilling than the previous bridge. On their way back from Niagara, they stayed overnight at a hotel in Saratoga Springs, where they invited the former president, Millard Fillmore, who lived nearby in Buffalo, to dinner at their hotel. And Kuhn noted, during the Kaya era, that's 1848 to 1854 in Japanese chronology, he was the president who sent Commodore Perry to Japan for the first time. Fillmore was very hearty at the age of 73. So these Japanese, whose country has in a sense been forced open and who have been forced into unequal treaties that they are trying to renegotiate to make them more favorable to Japan, call Willard Fillmore, contact him in his home in Buffalo, and invite him to come and have dinner with them, as much as to say, well, you may have done horrible things in sending Perry with his black ships to Japan, but we are now here, we're learning from the world, and in a sense, we are grateful to you for what you did. They probably didn't put it in those terms, but that's the kind of relationship that must have been going on that evening at that dinner in Saratoga Springs. Boston. They're still on their trip. And now, I should maybe explain it first. So on their way back from Niagara, they stayed overnight hotel. They visited Willard Fillmore. From Saratoga, they went by rail to Boston, arrived in Boston on June the 17th. A party of 35 were taken to the Revere House Hotel on Bowdoin Square, one of the most elegant hotels in Boston. Kuhn was impressed by Boston and wrote about its recent growth in comparison with that of other American cities. Something called a World Peace Jubilee was being held in Boston that summer. A huge coliseum had been built, where 50,000 people, it was said, and the embassy members were specially invited to Jubilee concerts. They attended on June the 18th and 19th. The band of the British Grenadier Guards played a patriotic American piece, for which the audience applauded wildly. and demanded encore after encore, Kuhn wrote. After the concert on June the 19th, they were taken up in a balloon. Aerial balloons were on demonstration in the summer, and the Japanese were given a ride in a balloon, as Kuhn records. This one back in Washington, so they've done their Northeastern tour. They've enjoyed it very much. They're still kicking their heels. Washington, D.C., treaty problems, and then the question of most favored nation status. The embassy returned to Washington, D.C. from their New England tour on June the 22nd. They still had time to kill in the humid heat of a Washington summer while they awaited the return of Okubo and Ito from Japan. Congress was still in recess. According to Kuhn, the city was hot and deserted. To pass the time and try to keep cool, they took carriage rides to local sites. Ito and Okubo arrived back in Washington on July the 22nd, so a month after the embassy had come back from their Northeastern tour and were kicking their heels, with orders not to pursue treaty revision with any single nation. Most favored nation status, or Saekoku Taigu, was a major problem. In other words, if they give preferences to the United States, for example, in negotiations with the United States, they might have to give similar or greater preferences to other countries that they negotiate with later. So they were told, forget it. Treaty negotiation isn't going to work. You better get on with your trip. The embassy leaders decided they would not be able to achieve favorable treaty revision in Washington, informed President Grant and Hamilton Fish that they would soon be leaving for Europe. This again is Boston. They're now going from Boston towards Europe in August the 2nd, 1872, a banquet. The embassy left Washington for Philadelphia, New York, and Boston en route for Europe on July the 27th, 1872. Before their departure from Boston, local merchants and the Boston Board of Trade organized a farewell banquet in their honor on August the 2nd. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Ralph Waldo Emerson attended and made speeches. Oliver Wendell Holmes composed a poem, which he read at the banquet for the occasion, as he said, greeting the lords of the rising sun. In other words, of course, Japan, the flag of Japan is the rising sun, etc. And here they are in Boston being described as, in poetry, the lords of the rising sun. And of course, behind this is Boston business interests and hopes from Boston, as well as from other cities, that there is trade and commerce to be developed, banking connections, etc., with this newly opened rising country of Japan. Kuhn recorded, at 4 p.m, the city hosted a banquet in our hotel, which we attended, which was attended by 180 people. After dinner, there were speeches, and the party finally ended at 10 o'clock. It was the most elaborate dinner. It was the most elaborate dinner we had attended since San Francisco. Here we see a crowd of young people sitting on the steps of a college. The kanji says, Buchu ni nisenin o keika shitaru nari, passing 2,000 years as if in a dream. In Boston, they visited Harvard and MIT, although it was the summer vacation. Boston was a city based upon education. Kuhn again felt the importance of education from elementary to college level and the need to promote practical and useful studies. He wrote that Japan had been living in a dream for 2,000 years. And of course the implication is that now we are waking up to reality. A scene perhaps showing MIT, the characters there read Joson Dampi, excessive respect for women, and belittling of men. There were some things Kuhn and other Japanese found it hard to accept in America. Kuhn complained about excessive respect for women, Joson Dampi, and he claimed that America was a country where men were put down. You might have asked the women of the day what they thought about Kakawa Denka, for the men. Boston scene, people kissing in public. This kind of public display of affection was not appreciated by the Japanese. I'm not sure they actually saw anything like this, but this is the kind of thing that as they're going, they're observing customs and practices, and something like this public display of affection, would not have appealed probably to the Japanese ambassadors. Here we see a map of the embassy's route across the United States. They've been on their travels since they left Japan for 7 months. They spent 6 months in the United States, visited some of its major cities from San Francisco to Chicago, Washington, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. They have been warmly welcomed, introduced to American people, to American society, to industry, politics, education, and culture. Kuhn provided a very positive parting appreciation of America. He said, "From our arrival in San Francisco until our departure from Boston, we transversed the breadth of America. If I summarize very simply what we actually witnessed, this whole land, taking after European culture, is filled with the spirit of independence and enthusiasm for promoting industry and accumulating property, and these are amply demonstrated in this country." And finally, Boston Harbor. Having seen and learned much, on August the 6th, 1872, the Japanese mission boarded the Cunard Line mail steamer Olympus, and after a farewell dinner on board, steamed out of Boston Harbor for England. Many citizens of Boston turned out to wave them farewell. Kuhn provided a very positive assessment of their experience in the United States. From our arrival in San Francisco until our departure from Boston, we transversed the breadth of America. If I summarize very simply what we actually witnessed, this whole land, taking after the European culture, is filled with the spirit of independence and enthusiasm, etc. You've already heard that, but that's his ending quote, and I will end with that. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for a few questions. I'll let you.
Yes, if I can, please. Yes.
You mentioned something about the Japanese seeing the Native Americans, and they gave like a synopsis of what happened to them. In any way, do you think they were any worried about how the Americans actually treated the Native Americans, and wondered if that could happen to them, or?
It's hard to tell, but I think Kuhn was, the tone as you read those sections is sympathetic. And he's interested. They're in a Pullman train traveling first class. And in many cases, they see them beside the tracks or perhaps at a railroad station where the train stops. And the Japanese on the train, the 100 or so who are traveling, some of them are talking among themselves saying, "Who are those people? What are those people?" They're asking for more information. There were a few Americans. DeLong was traveling with them and his wife, and there were perhaps a few others on the train who might have been able to answer more specific questions. And then clearly, as Kuhn was trying to write this up, he went deeper into the story. And I think it becomes clear that he sees these as the people who, whatever their origins were, wherever they had come from, they had been inhabitants of the land and were being harshly treated, and that this was unfair. Now, I'm not sure that he went beyond this to think that Japanese, for example, might be treated unfairly or were being treated unfairly. But this awareness, I think, is there on his part, and presumably it's something they were talking about as they were traveling. But it's a very interesting question, because one of the issues that I did mention again is the question of the treatment of Chinese workers who are coming in to San Francisco and the West Coast, California, and then moving to the Midwest and working in gold mines or helping to lay the tracks for the railroad or put up poles for the telegraph. And already there is a sense of resentment becoming evident in some areas of American society towards Chinese visitors. And DeLong clearly was aware of this, because while they were in San Francisco, the hotel, they were staying in the hotel, and there was an evening banquet and performance by a band of the California Guard, National Guard, who were playing in the street. And thousands of people gathered, because they were going to march in front of the hotel where the Japanese were staying. And Ambassador Iwakura, this is about 10 o'clock at night, after all of the performances and the parades have taken place, from the balcony of the hotel, Iwakura made a speech. DeLong was beside him and translated the speech. And of course, Iwakura is saying, thank you, we're extremely grateful for the generous treatment you have given us, etc. We're hoping to learn from, etc., etc. Nice things. And DeLong translated this. And I read somewhere, I have to check this carefully, that DeLong then made a kind of suggestion that these Japanese, there's 100 or so Japanese who have come as a distinguished embassy from Japan, sent by the Meiji Emperor of Japan, we should distinguish them from Chinese. And what he was saying subliminally, and quite, if he made a statement in those terms, very obviously to people that were already in San Francisco becoming sensitive to the issue of immigration, what he was saying is these people are special. And so DeLong had an awareness, because of his knowledge of the California, Nevada, those states, that these were sensitive issues. So this issue of race, racial identity, the question of the American Indians, all of these issues, I think, were there, but they're a little difficult to get at. And it's a very interesting area of study, I think. Yes, sorry.
What was the overall impression of Europe compared to the USA?
I'm less familiar with that, but they were, of course, as I mentioned, when they arrived in England, and the British ambassador in Tokyo had wanted them to go to Britain first, and Britain was at the height of its industrial development then, or approaching the height of its industrial development. Again, they were treated with tremendous respect, and they were deeply impressed by the industry in cities like Manchester and Liverpool, the organisation of London. I think they probably would have sort of balanced it out, but maybe they received more of a surprise in the United States than they did, because I think they were probably expecting, when they got to Britain, when they got to Prussia, to France and Prussia, that these were already highly industrialized countries and they expected to go and visit factories. Maybe in the United States they weren't quite so sure what they were going to be seeing, and yet they found that when they visited, for example, Boston, they were taken to woolen mills and silk factories in Massachusetts, these kinds of things. Probably they hadn't been prepared for that. So I think my sense in reading Kuhn is he was deeply impressed by Europe, but clearly left the United States. And his statement at the end gives a hint of that they were impressed that this great country, which they hadn't known very much about, was clearly developing in a highly industrial way, technological way, and it was a force to be reckoned with in the world economy. And Japan had much to learn, as much to learn maybe from America as it had to learn from Europe.